Welcome, dear friend, to this quiet harbor of rest. Tonight, our journey takes us to a place of profound significance, a city of stone and spirit that has captured the human imagination for millennia. Let us travel back together, on the gentle currents of story, to the 1st century CE, to the ancient land of Judea. Allow the sounds of your world to fade, and in their place, let the echoes of another time begin to rise. Breathe slowly, deeply, and imagine the air around you growing warm and dry, fragrant with the scent of desert dust, olive groves, and the distant, holy incense smoke from a temple that once stood as the center of a universe. We arrive in Jerusalem. In these years, just before its darkest hour, the city is a vibrant testament to Jewish faith and culture. It is a place of relative stability, a jewel set within the vast, sprawling framework of the Roman Empire. The streets are alive, a bustling symphony of human activity. Here, a merchant whose caravan has traveled for months from a distant land haggles over the price of silks and spices. There, a group of pilgrims, their faces etched with reverence and awe after a long and arduous journey, make their way through the crowded lanes, their eyes fixed on their sacred destination. In the cool shade of the city's many synagogues, scholars lean close together, their voices a low murmur as they debate the finer points of ancient law and scripture. Dominating the entire cityscape, rising majestic and brilliant against the Judean sky, is the Second Temple. Reconstructed and massively expanded by Herod the Great, it is an architectural marvel. Its gleaming white limestone walls seem to capture the very light of the sun, and its golden ornaments glitter with a divine promise. This is more than just a place of worship, it is the beating heart of the nation's economic, social, and spiritual life. It is a constant, breathtaking reminder to all who see it of Jerusalem's central, sacred role in their world. The air is thick with the murmur of prayers, the bleating of sacrificial lambs, and a palpable sense of devotion that has drawn people here for generations. But listen closely. Beneath this vibrant facade of normalcy, a discordant note can be heard. A shadow lingers in the corners of the sun-drenched courtyards. The stability provided by the Roman occupation has come at a significant cost. The weight of burdensome taxation presses down on the farmers and the merchants, a constant, draining pressure on their resources. The ever-present sight of Roman soldiers walking the same sacred streets is a source of friction. Their pagan customs, their foreign tongue, their very presence, feels to many like a slow, creeping erosion of a traditional way of life that has been cherished for centuries. This cultural tension mounts with each passing year, as the immense gravity of Roman influence subtly permeates daily life, from the style of new buildings to the language of commerce, creating a deep sense of cultural loss among those who hold fast to the old ways. The Roman governors sent to maintain order in this volatile land often struggle, their heavy-handed attempts to quell unrest only serving to deepen the resentment. Men like Pontius Pilate become notorious, their names whispered with a mixture of fear and contempt, their actions becoming cautionary tales that fuel the growing discontent. And in this atmosphere, more radical voices begin to find a willing audience. Religious zealots and political agitators gain influence, their impassioned speeches echoing in secret gatherings. Groups like the Zealots begin to advocate for a path of violent resistance against the Roman occupiers. An even more extreme offshoot, the Sicarii, or dagger men, spread terror through targeted assassinations, their actions creating an atmosphere of suspicion and fear. Apocalyptic preachers wander the land, their eyes burning with fervor, prophesying the imminent arrival of God's kingdom, a kingdom that would sweep away the Roman invaders in a tide of divine fire. The air in Jerusalem grows thick with this unspoken tension. It feels like the heavy, charged stillness before a great storm. Public demonstrations against Roman authority become more frequent, more intense. Minor skirmishes between protesters and Roman soldiers erupt with an alarming regularity, each one a small spark threatening to ignite a much larger blaze. A breaking point, many sense, is fast approaching. The signs of the coming conflict are there, for those with eyes to see. The Roman military presence in and around the Holy City is quietly bolstered. Additional cohorts of legionaries are stationed at strategic locations. The imposing fortress of Antonia, which looms over the temple complex like a stone sentinel, is reinforced, its walls built higher, its garrison expanded. And within the Jewish community, a mirror preparation takes place. Weapons are stockpiled in secret caches throughout the city's labyrinthine alleys. Young men, under the guise of religious study, begin to train in the arts of warfare, their hearts filled with a grim and fiery determination. The spark that finally ignites this simmering powder keg falls in the year 66 CE. The Roman procurator, Gessius Florus, in an act of profound ignorance or deliberate provocation, seizes a large quantity of silver from the sacred temple treasury. To the Jewish people, this is the ultimate sacrilege, a defilement of their most holy site. The protests that erupt are immediate and furious. And the Roman response is brutally swift. The suppression of the protests is so violent, so merciless, that it proves to be the final, unforgivable straw. The resentment, the anger, the sense of injustice that has been building for decades, finally explodes. The First Jewish-Roman War erupts with a fury that shocks even those who had long anticipated the conflict. What begins as a local revolt in Jerusalem quickly spreads like wildfire throughout the entire region of Judea. Emboldened Jewish rebels overwhelm scattered Roman garrisons, seizing control of large swaths of territory. This initial, stunning success sends shockwaves through the Roman Empire. A challenge has been made, a gauntlet thrown down. The greatest empire the world has ever known has been defied. The stage is now set for a confrontation of epic proportions, a clash of civilizations that will see the full, terrifying might of Rome brought to bear against the walls of Jerusalem, a confrontation that will seal the city's fate and forever alter the course of history. The shadow that has been gathering over the holy city is about to become a storm. The news of the successful revolt in Judea arrived in Rome not as a minor provincial disturbance, but as an intolerable affront to the majesty and authority of the empire. That a small, provincial population could overwhelm Roman garrisons and seize control of territory was a shock that reverberated through the halls of power on the Palatine Hill. The Emperor Nero, recognizing that such a challenge could not go unanswered lest it inspire similar rebellions in other corners of the empire, knew that a response of overwhelming and decisive force was required. The task of crushing this uprising would not be given to just any commander. It required a man of proven skill, unshakable resolve, and a deep understanding of brutal, effective warfare. The man he chose was Vespasian. Vespasian was a seasoned, battle-hardened general, a man forged in the crucible of Rome's military campaigns in Britain and Africa. He was not a man of grand political rhetoric, but of methodical, pragmatic, and relentless action. His appointment in the year 67 CE marked a pivotal moment. It was a clear signal to the world that Rome was now treating this not as a local skirmish, but as a full-scale war. A great and heavy thundercloud was beginning to form on the horizon, and its destination was the land of Judea. It would be a storm of iron and discipline, and Vespasian would be its guide. The campaign began in the spring of that year. Vespasian's strategy was not to march directly on Jerusalem, the heart of the rebellion. That would come later. His approach was far more systematic. He would first subdue the outlying regions, methodically strangling the rebellion by cutting off its support, crushing its smaller strongholds one by one, and driving the remaining resistance into a single, inescapable trap. His first target was Galilee, the northern region of Judea. The force he assembled was formidable, a testament to the seriousness of his mission. Approximately 60,000 troops, including 4 of Rome's legendary legions and their vast auxiliary support units, converged on the region. This was not merely an army, it was an instrument of imperial power, designed to grind any opposition into dust. The siege of the Galilean town of Jotapata became a grim and perfect example of Roman military effectiveness. The town, bravely defended by a Jewish commander named Josephus, held out against the overwhelming Roman onslaught for a prolonged and bitter period. But the outcome was never truly in doubt. The Romans, masters of siege warfare, employed their full arsenal of tactics. The relentless pounding of battering rams, the suffocating volleys of arrows from towering siege engines, and the disciplined advance of the legionaries eventually wore down the defenders. The town fell. This victory was significant not just for its strategic value, but because it resulted in the capture of the commander, Josephus. He would later become an invaluable, if reluctant, source of information for the Roman war effort, and it is through his eyes, as a historian, that we have such a vivid, though tragic, account of these events. As Vespasian's legions advanced through the Judean countryside, they employed tactics designed not just to defeat, but to demoralize. Their strategy was one of methodical reduction, destroying fortifications and crushing any hint of resistance with overwhelming force. They were not interested in the glory of open-field battles, they were interested in results. The grim testament of Josephus paints a harrowing picture of their advance. The Romans slew all the youth and burned the city, filling the sea with blood and the maritime parts with fire and slaughter. These words, carried on the wind from one terrified town to the next, served their purpose, striking fear into the hearts of those who might consider resisting the unstoppable tide. Despite being vastly outmatched in terms of organization, training, and equipment, the Jewish defenders fought with a fierce and desperate determination. Their resistance was fueled by a powerful combination of religious fervor and the primal desire to protect their homes and their way of life. But courage and passion, however intense, could not hold back the methodical, disciplined, and superbly equipped Roman legions. Slowly, inexorably, the Jewish forces were worn down, their strongholds falling one by one, their fighters pushed ever backward, toward the great prize, the final sanctuary, Jerusalem. As the campaign progressed, a new figure began to emerge as a capable and important commander within the Roman ranks, Vespasian's own son, Titus. His leadership skills, his ability to coordinate complex military operations, and his capacity to inspire his troops would prove to be of crucial importance in the later, most difficult stages of the war. It would be Titus who would ultimately stand before the walls of the Holy City, tasked with completing the mission his father had begun. The relentless Roman advance created a great wave of human suffering that washed over the land. As towns and villages fell to Vespasian's forces, displaced and desperate people, with nowhere else to go, fled towards the one place they believed would be safe. They sought refuge in Jerusalem. The Holy City's population began to swell dramatically, its ancient streets and neighborhoods overflowing with refugees. This massive influx of people, while perhaps adding to the number of potential defenders, placed an enormous and unsustainable pressure on the city's resources, its food, its water, its very ability to function. A devastating humanitarian crisis was beginning to take shape, a crisis that would compound the horrors of the coming siege. And so, by the year 70 CE, the stage was set. Vespasian's methodical campaign had succeeded in its goal. The rebellion had been systematically extinguished across the land, and Jerusalem now stood as the last major stronghold of Jewish resistance. The city's formidable defenses had been strengthened, but they were about to face their greatest test. The thunderous response of Rome, which began as a distant rumble in the hills of Galilee, was now right outside the gates. The great storm had finally arrived. For centuries, the city of Jerusalem had stood as a bastion of strength, its formidable defenses the envy of the ancient world. It was a city nestled in the embrace of steep ravines, its elevated position a natural deterrent to any invading army. And upon this natural foundation, walls of immense thickness and height had been constructed, masterpieces of engineering designed to repel any assault. It was a fortress that should have been able to withstand even the mighty legions of Rome for a great length of time. But as the Roman threat materialized at its gates, these impressive physical barriers could not protect the city from a more insidious rot, a disease that had taken hold within its very heart. Like a mighty, ancient oak, whose proud branches still reach for the heavens while its core is being hollowed out by decay, Jerusalem's true strength was being catastrophically undermined by internal strife. The defenders of the city, numbering around 20,000, were a fractious and volatile mix. They were not a single, disciplined army, but a collection of militias, desperate refugees who had fled the Roman advance, and fervent religious zealots. Far from presenting a united front against the existential threat that now faced them all, these disparate groups were locked in a bitter, merciless struggle for control of the city. The Holy City, on the eve of its greatest trial, found itself deeply and tragically fractured. Two main factions soon emerged as the dominant, warring forces. The first was led by a man named Simon Bar Giora, a charismatic and ruthless leader who held control over the upper city and the grand palace built by Herod. The second was led by John of Giscala, a cunning and ambitious figure who commanded the loyalty of the zealots and held sway over the most sacred ground of all, the Temple Mount and its surrounding neighborhoods. These two men, who should have been allies in the defense of their home, instead viewed each other with deep suspicion and hatred. Their forces clashed in the narrow streets, turning neighborhoods into battlegrounds. The very people they claimed to be protecting, the civilian population of Jerusalem, found themselves caught in a deadly crossfire, their lives and homes collateral damage in a pointless struggle for power. The atmosphere within the walls grew poisoned with paranoia. The zealots, under John's leadership, were particularly aggressive, viewing anyone who was not consumed by their own revolutionary fervor as a potential traitor. Moderate voices, those who might have counseled reason or negotiation, were systematically silenced, forced to flee, or worse. The priest Josephus, the same man who had once commanded Jewish forces against the Romans, now found himself on the outside, his pleas for unity and a negotiated peace falling on the deaf ears of men consumed by their own ambition and ideological purity. In a bloody climax of this internal strife, John of Giscala's group ambushed and murdered Eleazar ben Simon, the leader of a third, smaller faction, consolidating their power in the most brutal way imaginable. But the most devastating act of this internal war, a moment of shocking and tragic self-sabotage, was yet to come. In the madness of their struggle for supremacy, in a desperate attempt to gain an advantage over one another, the warring factions committed an act that would seal the city's doom more surely than any Roman battering ram. They set fire to each other's vital grain stores. Imagine the scene: the great storehouses, filled with the grain that was meant to sustain the entire city through a prolonged siege, are deliberately set ablaze. The night sky above the holy city is illuminated not by Roman torches, but by the fires of its own defenders. The precious sustenance, the very key to survival, turns to black smoke and bitter ash. It was a senseless, irreversible act of mutual destruction. The leaders, in their struggle to control a city, had just guaranteed its starvation. As Titus's legions began to construct their siege works, methodically building a line of circumvallation to cut off all access to the city, the terrible magnitude of this blunder became painfully apparent. The city was now not only surrounded by an external enemy, but it was also besieged from within by the certainty of a coming famine. The lack of a unified command structure meant there was no coherent plan to repel the Roman assault. Each faction jealously guarded its own territory, its own remaining supplies, its own fighters. They prioritized their own survival and their own power over the collective defense of Jerusalem. The city's defenses, which required coordination and a pooling of all resources, were rendered fatally flawed. The tension within the walls reached a fever pitch. The Zealots intensified their campaign of violence against anyone they perceived as lacking in revolutionary zeal. Those who dared to whisper of negotiation or surrender were branded as collaborators and were often dealt with harshly, their fates a grim warning to any others who might lose their resolve. The city that should have been a unified stronghold of faith and determination had become a pressure cooker of suspicion, retribution, and despair. It was a powder keg, primed and ready to explode. And it was into this fractured, self-consuming city that the full might of the Roman army was about to descend. The thunderous response of Rome had arrived, only to find that its enemy had already begun the work of its own destruction. As the first great siege engines of the Roman army were being assembled and the massive circumvallation line began to snake its way around the city, a timeless tradition was underway. It was the season of Passover, the most sacred of festivals, a time when Jews from across Judea and beyond would make a pilgrimage to the holy city to celebrate in the shadow of the great temple. In a move of brilliant and ruthless strategic cunning, the Roman general Titus made a fateful decision. He permitted the streams of pilgrims to enter Jerusalem, his legions watching as thousands upon thousands of hopeful worshippers flowed through the city gates. But once they were inside, he prevented their departure. The noose was being drawn, and the trap was being set. Imagine the scene. The pilgrims arrive, their hearts filled with devotion, their minds focused on the ancient rituals that have defined their people for centuries. The streets of Jerusalem, already crowded with refugees, now swell to an unimaginable density. The air, which should have been filled with the joyous sounds of celebration and the festive aroma of Passover meals, instead grows thick with a new kind of tension, a confused and growing murmur of fear. They have come to a place of spiritual sanctuary, but they soon begin to realize that they have walked into a prison. The transformation of Jerusalem from a holy city into a crucible of desperation is swift and jarring. The great Temple Mount, the very destination of their pilgrimage, becomes a makeshift refuge for those who find themselves unexpectedly imprisoned within the city walls. Its courtyards, which should have been filled with the devout performing their sacred rites, now overflow with bewildered families seeking shelter and answers that will not come. The Roman strategy proved to be devastatingly effective. The very traditions that had drawn these thousands of people to Jerusalem now served to entrap them. The city's resources, already critically damaged by the internal burning of the grain stores, now buckled completely under the immense weight of its suddenly swollen population. Food and water, already becoming scarce, were now subject to an impossible demand. The act of self-sabotage committed by the city's warring factions was now magnified into a full-blown humanitarian catastrophe by the careful design of their enemy. What was intended to be a time of spiritual renewal was transformed into a nightmare of deprivation and suffering. The influx of pilgrims had a complex and ultimately devastating impact on Jerusalem's defense. Some of the more able-bodied visitors, driven by religious zeal or a sense of shared duty, did join the ranks of the city's defenders. This provided a temporary and unexpected reinforcement, a brief boost to the city's fighting capability and morale. But the vast majority of the pilgrims, families, the elderly, the young, were entirely unprepared for the harsh realities of a besieged city. They quickly became an additional and overwhelming burden on the already strained resources. As the last gaps in the Roman siege wall were closed, the reality of the situation descended upon the city like a suffocating shroud. They were sealed in. Hope of relief, of escape, of resupply, was now gone. This new level of desperation only exacerbated the tensions that already plagued Jerusalem's defenders. The factional divisions, which had momentarily been overshadowed by the initial shock of the Roman assault, now threatened to unravel completely. The different groups, their leaders, and their fighters now began to vie for control over the rapidly diminishing food supplies, their internal struggles reignited by the new pressures of the trapped and hungry population. For the Romans, watching from their fortified camps, the knowledge that their strategy was working as intended only bolstered their resolve. They could see the smoke from the city, hear the distant cries, and understand the growing desperation of those trapped within. They knew that time was now their greatest ally. The longer the siege continued, the weaker Jerusalem's defenses would become, not just from the relentless assault of Roman arms, but from the internal strife and the silent, creeping enemy of starvation that their Passover trap had unleashed. Before them now stood their first major obstacle, the first great physical test of their military might against the city's defenses, the third wall. It was a formidable barrier, a marvel of first-century engineering, its massive stone blocks and strategic towers a symbol of the city's resilience. Titus, recognizing the wall's critical importance, marshaled the full might of his army against it, preparing to begin the violent and bloody work of breaking down the outer defenses of the now imprisoned Holy City. Before the Roman legions stood their first great challenge, the third wall of Jerusalem. This was not merely a wall, it was a statement of power and defiance, the newest and most formidable of the city's fortifications. Its massive stone blocks, some so large it seemed only giants could have moved them, were fitted together with masterful precision. Square towers projected from its length at regular intervals, providing strong points from which the defenders could command the surrounding landscape. Recognizing that this barrier was the key to unlocking the city, Titus marshaled the full, terrifying might of his army against it. The initial phase of the siege began not with the clash of swords, but with a sound, a deep, rhythmic, and thunderous pounding that would become the grim heartbeat of the city for days and weeks to come. Imagine the scene from within the city walls. The Roman forces have transformed the serene Judean hills into a militarized zone, a sprawling city of leather tents and disciplined industry. Great wooden beasts, the mighty battering rams, are wheeled slowly into position, their heavy, iron-shod heads swinging like pendulums of destruction. Behind them, enormous siege towers, veritable wooden castles on wheels, are pushed forward by teams of straining men and oxen. These towers, rising high against the skyline, allowed Roman archers and soldiers to engage the defenders at eye level, a terrifying new dimension to ancient warfare. The assault began as a symphony of destruction. The constant, earth-shaking thump-thump-thump of the battering rams against stone was a sound that seemed to penetrate not just the walls, but the very bones of those huddled within the city. It was accompanied by the terrifying whoosh of flaming projectiles launched from catapults, arcing through the sky like malevolent comets before crashing down into the city's crowded neighborhoods. From the siege towers, a relentless rain of arrows descended upon the defenders who manned the walls. In response to this mechanical and impersonal assault, the Jewish defenders demonstrated remarkable courage and desperate ingenuity. They refused to simply wait for their walls to crumble. Under the cover of darkness, they would launch daring sorties, bursting from the city gates in surprise attacks, their goal to disrupt the Roman siege works. These were moments of intense, chaotic, and brutal hand-to-hand combat. Defenders, armed with torches and pitch, would attempt to fight their way to the precious siege engines, hoping to set fire to the massive wooden structures. The Romans, drawing upon their extensive experience, employed innovative tactics to safeguard their equipment, building protective sheds and organizing disciplined fire brigades. Every night became a deadly contest of wills, a frantic dance of attack and defense played out in the flickering torchlight between the city wall and the Roman lines. The Romans, methodical as ever, also continued their larger strategic work. Even as the assault on the third wall raged, engineering corps worked tirelessly on the Great Circumvallation Line, a wall facing a wall, designed to completely seal off any remaining supply lines and prevent any hope of escape. The toll on both sides became increasingly apparent with each passing day. The constant barrage of projectiles, the grueling physical demands of both attack and defense, and the vicious close-quarters combat of the nightly raids resulted in a steady stream of mounting casualties. Roman soldiers faced not only the determined resistance of the defenders but also the natural challenges of Jerusalem's terrain, including its steep ravines and elevated position. Yet, despite being vastly outnumbered and out-equipped, the defenders of Jerusalem continued to display an astonishing bravery. They utilized the city's complex network of streets and buildings directly behind the wall to stage ambushes, to quickly reinforce weakened sections, and to confound the Roman efforts. But the relentless, systematic pressure of the Roman assault began to take its inevitable toll. Under the continuous, thunderous pounding, great cracks began to appear in the massive stone blocks. Sections of the wall, which had seemed eternal, began to show signs of instability. For 15 days, the third wall stood firm against the Roman onslaught. For 15 days, the air was filled with the cacophony of war. But on the 15th day, the inevitable occurred. A section of the wall, battered and undermined for 2 relentless weeks, finally gave way. With a deafening roar that sent a wave of terror through the city, the massive stones crumbled, collapsing into a great heap of rubble and dust. The Jewish historian Josephus, who witnessed the event, wrote that the noise of the falling wall was so great, it was as if the whole city had been overthrown. A breach had been created. As Roman soldiers, forming their famous tortoise-like testudo formation with shields held high, poured through the gap, the nature of the battle instantly transformed. The fight was no longer about walls and siege engines, it had become a nightmarish urban struggle. The narrow streets of the city's northern quarter, known as Bezetha or the New City, transformed into killing grounds where every corner, every doorway, every rooftop concealed a potential for sudden death. The Jewish fighters, executing a strategic withdrawal from the collapsed wall, drew upon their intimate knowledge of Jerusalem's labyrinthine layout to mount a fierce and effective resistance. They employed guerrilla tactics, launching surprise attacks against the advancing Roman columns before melting back into the maze of alleys and homes. Houses became makeshift fortresses, their doorways barricaded, their windows turned into firing positions. The confined spaces negated much of Rome's military superiority, as the tightly packed legionaries in their rigid formations made for easy targets. The battle for the new city raged for 5 grueling days. The Romans, accustomed to a more open and organized form of warfare, found themselves embroiled in a bloody, inch-by-inch struggle. The battle swung back and forth, with the defenders managing at one point to push the Romans back out of the breach, a brief and heroic, but ultimately doomed, success. The Romans, with their endless reserves and unshakable discipline, regrouped and pressed the assault again. Slowly, methodically, and at a great cost in blood, they secured their foothold inside the first line of defense, ready to bring their engines of war to bear against the city's second wall. The outer skin of Jerusalem had been peeled away, exposing the city to an even more intimate and brutal phase of the conflict to come. The prolonged and brutal siege had transformed the holy city of Jerusalem into a crucible of unimaginable suffering. But now, the sharp, Percussive clang of steel on steel and the thunderous roar of collapsing walls began to be replaced by a far more insidious and heartbreaking soundscape. It was the sound of a city starving. The pangs of hunger, at first a private misery, now resonated more loudly than the clash of battle, casting a dark, silent shadow over the once vibrant streets. The two critical wounds that the city had inflicted upon itself, the mad, factional burning of its own grain stores and the strategic Passover trap laid by Titus that had swelled its population to an unsustainable level, now began to hemorrhage the very lifeblood of its inhabitants. With each passing day, the specter of famine loomed larger, its gaunt figure walking unseen through every home and alleyway. The effects of this slow, creeping starvation soon became etched into the very fabric of daily life. The streets, which had once bustled with commerce and echoed with religious fervor, now grew quiet, punctuated only by the weak cries of the hungry and the slow, shuffling feet of those searching endlessly for any morsel of sustenance. The faces of the people became gaunt, their eyes hollow, their bodies emaciated. It was as if the city itself was wasting away, its vibrant energy being systematically drained. As the organized distribution of food collapsed, a desperate and primal hunt for anything edible began. Citizens resorted to consuming items that were never meant for human consumption. Leather belts and sandals, worn thin from use, were boiled for hours to soften them into a wretched, barely edible substance. The shields of soldiers, their leather coverings, were stripped and chewed. Even the stray blades of grass and weeds that poked through the cracks in the cobblestones were plucked and eaten by the famished. The social fabric, which had held for centuries, began to unravel under this immense pressure. The historian Josephus, an eyewitness to this horror, recorded scenes of unimaginable desperation. He wrote of a city where the bonds of love and family were grotesquely inverted by the primal need to survive. Wives, he wrote, were snatching food from husbands, children from fathers, and, most pitiable of all, mothers from their infants. Fortunes, once a measure of a man's status, were rendered meaningless. The wealthy, their coffers filled with useless gold, would exchange entire inheritances, vast estates and precious jewels, for a single measure of wheat or a handful of moldy barley. In the darkest corners of the city, grim whispers began to circulate of even more horrific measures, of human desperation reaching its absolute nadir, a grim testament to the capacity of siege warfare to strip away the veneer of civilization itself. The defenders of Jerusalem, facing their own dire circumstances as their strength began to fail them, made the agonizing decision to requisition what little food remained for the fighting force. This move, while perhaps strategically necessary for maintaining the city's defense, left the vast civilian population, the elderly, the women, the children, to face the full, unmitigated brunt of starvation. It was a cruel and tragic choice, one that further exacerbated the suffering and tensions within the besieged city. The psychological toll of this prolonged starvation was as devastating as the physical. Hunger-induced delirium became commonplace, with many wandering the streets in a daze, their minds lost in a fog of deprivation and despair. As the siege wore on, the streets of Jerusalem became a grim testament to the power of this silent enemy. Thousands of emaciated bodies began to litter the alleyways and homes, their silent forms a stark contrast to the vibrant city that had existed mere months before. The sight of so many dead, victims not of Roman swords but of hunger, served as a brutal, daily reminder of the siege's effectiveness and the dire straits in which the defenders found themselves. This was a war of attrition, and the city was losing. The slow, inexorable nature of the famine wore down not just the bodies of the besieged, but their will to resist. And then, in this moment of ever-deepening desperation, when all hope seemed lost, an unexpected and startling turn of events occurred. From the Roman camp, an order was given. Titus, the Roman general, made the surprising decision to temporarily halt his assault. He had seen the suffering, he had recognized the terrible toll the siege was taking on both sides, and perhaps seeking to avoid the further destruction of what was still a magnificent city, he decided to extend an offer. He would dispatch an emissary, an unexpected figure, to the walls of Jerusalem. For the first time in many weeks, the thunderous noise of war was replaced by a profound and suspenseful quiet. A single, fleeting, and almost unbelievable glimmer of hope had appeared. The city, holding its collective, starving breath, waited to see what would come next. Into the suspenseful quiet that had fallen over the besieged city, a lone figure approached the massive stone walls. It was Josephus, the Jewish historian, the former general of Galilee, now an emissary for the Roman side. He was a man caught between two worlds, tasked with persuading his own people to accept the terms of their enemy. As he stood within hailing distance, his voice, filled with a complex mixture of authority, reason, and profound sorrow, rose up towards the battlements. He spoke of the futility of continued resistance against the overwhelming power of Rome. He pleaded with the defenders to save their own lives, the lives of their families, and most importantly, to preserve the magnificent and holy temple from certain destruction. His words, carried on the dry Judean air, were met with a torrent of reactions from the starving defenders who lined the walls, jeers, insults, and hurled stones from some, but from others, a dangerous and tempting silence. Within the city, Titus's offer and Josephus's appeal ignited the smoldering embers of factional conflict into a raging fire. In the dimly lit chambers where the city's leadership was gathered, an intense and desperate debate began. There were those, the pragmatists, who saw the offer for what it was, the last, single opportunity to avoid total annihilation. Their arguments were born of the grim reality they saw every day on the streets, the gaunt faces of starving children, the ever-growing piles of the dead. For them, saving the people and the temple was the only sane and righteous path, even if it meant the humiliation of surrender. But their voices were drowned out by the fiery rhetoric of the hardliners, the zealots, led by men like John of Giscala. For them, Josephus was a traitor, his words the poison of collaboration. They argued that any talk of surrender was a betrayal of their divine mission, an abandonment of their covenant with God. They spoke of faith, of the certainty of divine intervention, of a miraculous salvation that would surely come if only they held fast. Their resolve, hardened by months of desperate struggle and a fervent, unshakable belief, could not be swayed by logic or appeals to mercy. In the end, their voices prevailed. The offer was rejected. The window for a peaceful resolution, which had been opened for just a fleeting moment, was slammed shut. The brief glimmer of hope was extinguished, and the city, having made its fateful choice, now braced for the inevitable storm. The fury of the Roman war machine, held in check during the brief negotiation, was now unleashed with renewed and focused intensity. All eyes, and all military might, turned to a single, critical objective, the Antonia fortress. This was not merely a fort, it was the sentinel of the Temple Mount, a formidable stronghold perched at its northwest corner, its thick walls and strong towers a final, defiant barrier. Titus knew that to take the temple, he must first conquer this fortress. The Roman legions sprang into action, employing the full, terrifying ingenuity of their siegecraft. The thunderous pounding of battering rams began anew, their relentless impacts shaking the very rock on which the fortress was built. But the primary effort was one of colossal engineering. Under a constant, withering fire from the Jewish defenders above, thousands upon thousands of Roman soldiers and laborers began the monumental task of constructing enormous earthen ramps. It was a scene of almost ant-like industry, a mountain of earth, timber, and stone being slowly and methodically raised against the fortress walls, designed to lift the Roman siege engines to the same height as their target. The Jewish defenders, from their elevated position, fought with desperate ferocity. They rained down a ceaseless barrage of arrows, stones, and heavy boulders upon the men working below. They launched devastating sorties, attempting to burn the ever-growing ramps and the precious siege engines. The protracted and brutal struggle exacted a heavy toll on both sides. Roman legionaries fell by the score, but their places were instantly taken by others, their discipline unwavering. The defenders, weakened by starvation, fought with a strength that seemed to transcend their physical condition, their resolve steeled by the knowledge that they were protecting the very entrance to their most sacred space. The once pristine walls of the fortress now stood scarred and battered, a grim reflection of the brutal conflict that raged at its base. As days bled into weeks, the turning point came not from a heroic charge or a strategic masterstroke, but from the heavens themselves. Heavy summer rains began to fall, saturating the ground and weakening the foundations of the northern wall. The constant, shuddering impact of the Roman battering rams, combined with this elemental assistance, finally proved to be too much. In the dead of night, with a thunderous roar that was heard throughout the city, a great section of the northern wall collapsed. It was a sound of profound and terrible finality. Seizing the opportunity presented by the darkness and the confusion, Titus immediately ordered a daring night assault. A select cohort of Roman troops, moving with disciplined speed, poured through the breach. The battle for the Antonia fortress had begun. The narrow confines of the fortress negated much of the Roman numerical advantage, and the fighting devolved into a chaotic and brutal series of close-quarters engagements. Room by room, corridor by corridor, the Romans fought their way deeper into the stone labyrinth. The Jewish defenders, realizing that this was their last stand within these walls, fought with a renewed and savage fervor. Every inch of ground was contested, every doorway a potential choke point, every hallway a killing ground. The clash of steel on steel, the desperate shouts, and the sounds of struggle echoed through the stone halls in the disorienting darkness. But the momentum of the Roman assault proved unstoppable. As dawn finally broke, casting its gray light over the scene of carnage, the Roman standard, the eagle, was raised over the battered remains of the Antonia fortress. The formidable stronghold, which had for so long stood as a symbol of Jewish resistance, had finally fallen. Like a great tree toppled by a relentless storm, the fortress that had once seemed impregnable now lay broken and conquered. And from its conquered heights, the Roman soldiers could now look down upon their ultimate prize, the final sanctuary, now exposed and vulnerable before them, the magnificent, sprawling, and sacred Temple Mount. From the conquered heights of the Antonia fortress, the Roman legions now gazed upon a sight of breathtaking magnificence. Spread out before them, rising majestically into the air, was the Second Temple. This was not merely a building, it was an architectural marvel, a city within a city, its gleaming white walls and golden-adorned gates presenting a final, formidable challenge. Its courtyards and porticos, which in times of peace were filled with the gentle murmur of prayer and the sweet smoke of sacrifices, had now transformed into a fortress of last resort. For the Jewish defenders, their ranks thinned by months of relentless siege and gnawing starvation, this was the final redoubt. This was not just a battle for survival, but a sacred, divine mandate to protect the very heart of their faith, the place where they believed God Himself dwelled on earth. The final phase of the siege began. The Romans, with their characteristic efficiency, brought the full might of their war machine to bear against the temple's outer walls. Massive battering rams, which had already shattered the city's outer defenses, were once again deployed, their thunderous impacts pounding relentlessly against the sacred stone. Towering siege engines were maneuvered into place, allowing Roman archers to rain down volley after volley of arrows upon the defenders who lined the walls and rooftops. The air grew thick and acrid with the smoke of burning pitch and the fine dust of crumbling masonry as the assault intensified. The Jewish fighters, though physically weakened, fought with a spiritual fervor that transcended mere military duty. It was a strength that belied their emaciated condition, a fire in their eyes that burned brighter than any Roman torch. They hurled themselves against the Roman onslaught with a desperate, reckless abandon, their every action a prayer and a defiance. The historian Josephus, watching these final, tragic moments, captured the intensity of their resolve. As the first Roman set fires began to lick at the wooden structures of the temple complex, he wrote, as the flames shot into the air, the Jews sent up a cry that matched the calamity and dashed to the rescue, with no thought now of saving their lives or husbanding their strength, for that which they had guarded so devotedly was disappearing before their eyes. As the battle raged, a historical debate that would echo through the centuries began to unfold. According to Josephus's account, Titus, the Roman commander, did not wish to destroy the temple. He saw it as a magnificent prize of war, a testament to the glory of his victory and the magnanimity of Rome, and he supposedly gave orders to extinguish the flames. Yet other sources, including the Roman historian Tacitus, suggest that Titus may have seen the temple for what it was, the symbolic heart of Jewish resistance, and believed that its destruction was a military necessity. Whatever his true intentions, the chaos of battle soon took on a life of its own, a raging, uncontrollable force that would sweep away any general's command. As Roman troops pressed their advantage, breaching the outer courts, the fires began to spread uncontrollably. Fanned by the hot summer winds, the flames leaped from wooden beam to wooden beam, from rich tapestry to cedar-paneled chamber. The defenders found themselves trapped in a horrifying crucible, caught between the advancing swords of the legionaries and the suffocating, all-consuming embrace of the spreading conflagration. Their options, their world, their hope, all were dwindling with each passing moment. The final moments of the Second Temple were a scene of unimaginable horror and grandeur. In the midst of the carnage, some priests, in a final, extraordinary act of devotion, continued to perform their sacred rituals, their chanted prayers a faint, defiant whisper against the roaring inferno. As the intense heat grew, the great golden plates and ornaments that adorned the sacred structure began to melt, creating shimmering rivulets of molten gold that flowed down the sanctuary steps and between the massive, cracking stone blocks. It was a hauntingly beautiful image of beauty dissolving amidst destruction, of the sacred becoming profane. Then, at the height of the chaotic fighting, a single Roman soldier, caught up in the frenzy of the battle, seized a burning brand and hurled it through a small window into the Holy of Holies, the innermost sanctuary of the temple. The flames caught hold instantly. The destruction was now absolute and irreversible. The great structure, which had stood for centuries as the center of Jewish worship, was now engulfed in a pillar of fire that rose to the heavens. The destruction occurred on the 9th day of the Hebrew month of Av, Tisha B'Av. This date, already associated with great calamities in Jewish tradition, would henceforth be observed as the most solemn day of mourning and fasting in the Jewish calendar. The loss of the temple was more than a military defeat, it necessitated a fundamental shift in Jewish religious life, as the central place of worship and sacrifice was suddenly and violently erased from the earth. The fire roared for hours, the sound of its fury mingling with the agonized screams of those trapped within. Josephus described the hellish scene in vivid detail. Round the altar the heaps of corpses grew higher and higher, while down the sanctuary steps poured a river of blood, and the bodies of those killed at the top slithered to the bottom. When the flames finally subsided and the great clouds of smoke began to clear, the full, breathtaking extent of the devastation became apparent. The once mighty temple, the beating heart of a nation, had collapsed into a mountain of scorched rubble and smoldering ash. Of the grand complex, only a portion of the outer retaining wall remained standing, the western wall, a silent, stoic testament to all that had been lost. Through the lingering smoke, the surviving Jewish defenders, their faces blackened with soot, their eyes reflecting the ruin of their world, faced a grim and undeniable reality. Their holy sanctuary was gone. Through the haze of smoke and sorrow that shrouded the ruins of the temple, the surviving Jewish defenders faced a grim and undeniable reality. Their holy sanctuary, the center of their universe, was gone. Their world was now a landscape of ash and smoldering embers. Yet, even as grief and despair threatened to consume them, the primal instinct for survival, mixed with a final, defiant surge of courage, burned on. The last remnants of the city's fighting force, a desperate collection of zealots and warriors, retreated from the devastation of the Temple Mount to the upper city, the heavily fortified residential area on Jerusalem's high western hill. This district, with its wealthy homes, its strong defensive position, and the formidable royal palace of Herod at its heart, would become the final stage for this epic tragedy, the last bastion of Jewish resistance. The Roman legions, having achieved their primary objective, now turned their full, methodical attention to this last pocket of defiance. The final phase of the siege began, an operation to systematically cleanse the city of its remaining defenders. Titus, leaving no room for another prolonged struggle, approached the assault with ruthless precision. The tactics were now perfectly adapted to the brutal realities of urban warfare. The narrow, rubble-strewn streets that had once favored the defenders with opportunities for ambush now became a deadly maze as the disciplined Roman units advanced, clearing house after house, alleyway after alleyway. At the heart of this final assault stood the mighty battering rams, those engines of destruction that had already shattered two of the city's great walls. They were now brought to bear against the thick walls of Herod's palace, the last major structure still in rebel hands. As the palace walls began to crumble under the relentless pounding, the conflict once again devolved into the bitter, intimate chaos of hand-to-hand fighting. But this was different. This was not a battle for strategic advantage, this was the fight at the end of the world. The Jewish warriors, vastly outnumbered, weakened by months of starvation, and with all hope of victory long extinguished, fought with a determination born of pure desperation. For many, capture meant slavery in the mines, a fate worse than death, or being forced to fight as a gladiator in a Roman arena for the entertainment of their conquerors. Faced with such a future, they chose to fight to the very last breath, to die as free men on the soil of their holy city. Every opulent room of the palace, every narrow alleyway of the upper city, became a final, bloody battlefield. For the Roman soldiers, the prolonged and brutal siege had also taken a profound psychological toll. Weeks of grueling combat, of watching their comrades fall in vicious ambushes, had hardened their hearts. The pent-up frustration and exhaustion, now unleashed in this final phase, often found release in acts of remorseless brutality. They showed little mercy, their disciplined advance turning into a grim and bloody mopping-up operation, extinguishing the last embers of resistance with cold efficiency. In these final, desperate hours, a poignant and tragic scene of unity unfolded. The two men whose bitter rivalry had so catastrophically divided the city from within, Simon Bar Giora and John of Giscala, now found themselves fighting side by side, their personal ambitions rendered meaningless in the face of annihilation. Their reconciliation, a powerful symbol of Jewish unity against a common foe, had come far, far too late. It was a unity born not of wisdom, but of shared doom. The few remaining defenders, rallying around their leaders in these last moments, drew a fleeting strength from this newfound solidarity, a final, defiant gesture against the inexorable advance of the Roman legions. The end, when it came, was methodical and absolute. On the 7th day of September, after days of intense and bloody fighting, the last pockets of resistance in the upper city were finally overwhelmed. The Roman standards, the eagles of the legions, were raised over the smoking ruins of the palace. Jerusalem had fallen. The city that had stood for centuries as the proud center of Jewish religious and cultural life, the city that had defied the might of Rome for months, was now completely and utterly conquered. The great battle was over. And in the silence that followed, a new and terrible chapter was about to begin. As the dust began to settle over the smoking ruins of Jerusalem, a new and chilling order was given by the Roman command. The war was over, but the punishment had just begun. Titus, determined to make an example of the city and to ensure that no such rebellion could ever take root here again, ordered the systematic destruction of nearly everything that was still standing. The once proud city, with its grand buildings, its bustling markets, and its sacred spaces, was to be methodically reduced to rubble. Roman soldiers, their work of combat now replaced with the grim work of demolition, tore down the remaining walls, the palaces, and the homes, leaving only a few of the tallest towers standing as a stark monument to the power of the army that had conquered them. The physical heart of the Jewish nation was being deliberately and systematically erased from the earth. For the survivors of the siege, the end of the fighting did not bring relief, but a future fraught with uncertainty and peril. A great sorting began. Many were executed. But for tens of thousands of others, a different fate awaited. They were rounded up, their identities as citizens of Jerusalem stripped away, and they were forcibly dispersed across the vast expanse of the Roman Empire. The historian Josephus reported that some 97,000 Jews were captured and enslaved. This mass enslavement represented a profound spiritual and cultural upheaval. For a people whose entire identity, their faith, their history, their very being, was so intrinsically linked to this specific ancestral land and this holy city, being forcibly uprooted and scattered was a catastrophe of the soul. The fate of these captives was varied, but almost always brutal. Many of the young, able-bodied men were sent to the grueling labor of the Egyptian mines, their lives to be spent in darkness, chipping away at stone for the glory of the empire that had destroyed their world. Others were sent to the great cities of the empire to be trained as gladiators, forced to fight and die for the entertainment of Roman crowds in the arenas. Families were torn apart, communities shattered, and a people were cast to the winds, beginning the great, sorrowful expansion of the Jewish diaspora. They became refugees, fleeing to other lands, carrying with them nothing but the clothes on their backs and, deep within their hearts, the indelible memories of their lost home and the sacred traditions of their faith. While Judea was shrouded in mourning, Rome was preparing for a celebration. In the year 71 CE, the victorious generals, Vespasian, now emperor, and his son Titus, were honored with a grand triumph, a spectacular procession through the streets of Rome to celebrate their victory. This was a spectacle unique in Roman history. Triumphs were typically reserved for the conquest of new foreign territories, not for the brutal subjugation of an existing province's population. Its purpose was clear: to display the unassailable power of Rome and the terrible consequences of defiance. Imagine the scene. The streets of Rome are thronged with cheering crowds. The procession is a river of imperial power and looted splendor. At the front are the captured Jewish leaders, including the defiant Simon Bar Giora, paraded in chains as living trophies of the Roman victory. Behind them, carried on elaborate floats, are the priceless treasures looted from the destroyed temple. And there, amidst the spoils, is the most sacred object of all, the great golden menorah, its 7 branches glinting in the Italian sunlight as it is carried, far from its home, through the heart of the pagan empire that had desecrated it. This This parade of stolen sanctity was later immortalized in a relief carved into the Arch of Titus, a monument that stands in Rome to this day, a silent stone testament to the events of that terrible summer. Back in the ruins of Jerusalem, the landscape was being permanently altered. A permanent Roman military garrison, the 10th Legion, was established on the flattened ground, its presence a constant discouragement to any Jews who might have dreamed of returning. The city that had once been the vibrant heart of Jewish religious and cultural life now pulsed to a different, martial rhythm, its dusty, empty streets echoing only with the tread of Roman boots. The physical and demographic center of Jewish life had been hollowed out. It was from this crucible of destruction and dispersal that the future of the Jewish people would have to be forged. They would have to learn how to be a people without a homeland, a faith without its central altar, a culture without its heart. It was a challenge of unimaginable proportions, but one that would lead to one of the most remarkable transformations in the history of religion. In the immediate aftermath of the destruction, the Jewish people faced a profound existential crisis. The temple, the magnificent heart of their religious and cultural life for centuries, the place where heaven and earth were believed to meet, was gone. The entire system of worship, centered on priestly rituals and animal sacrifices, was now impossible. It was a moment of utter desolation, a crisis that could have meant the end of a civilization. And yet, from these ashes of despair, one of the most remarkable transformations in the history of religion began to take shape. The seeds of this transformation were planted by the foresight of a single, wise man. During the siege, a sage named Yohanan ben Zakkai, realizing the catastrophe that was to come, reportedly had himself smuggled out of the besieged city in a coffin to meet with the Roman general. He did not ask for military victory or political power. He made a simple, yet profoundly important, request, for permission to establish a small center of Jewish learning in the coastal town of Jabna. This seemingly modest act would prove to be the key to the survival of Judaism itself. In Jabna, Yohanan ben Zakkai and his fellow scholars began the monumental task of reimagining their faith for a world without a temple. This was the birth of what would come to be known as Rabbinic Judaism. The shift was radical and brilliant. If worship could no longer be centered on a physical place and its sacrificial rituals, then it would be recentered on something eternal and portable, the sacred text of the Torah, and the vast body of oral law and interpretation that surrounded it. The study of Scripture, the earnest debate over its meaning, and the diligent observance of religious law in every aspect of daily life became the new forms of worship. The priest, whose authority was tied to the temple, was gradually replaced by the rabbi, the scholar and teacher. The synagogue, once a secondary place of local gathering, now took center stage as the focal point of Jewish communal life, a miniature sanctuary that could be built anywhere in the world. Judaism, in essence, became a faith of the book, not of the building. This incredible adaptation made it portable, allowing the Jewish people to maintain their identity, their faith, and their traditions even in the midst of a centuries-long diaspora, scattered far from their ancestral home. At the same time, the fall of Jerusalem had a profound and accelerating impact on another nascent faith, Christianity. For the small but growing number of followers of Jesus of Nazareth, the destruction of the temple was interpreted as a divine sign, a fulfillment of prophecies that they believed reinforced their claims about Jesus's messianic status. This interpretation created a decisive and final break between the burgeoning Christian movement and its Jewish roots. With the center of traditional Jewish authority destroyed, Christianity was freed to develop its own distinct theology and practices, turning its face away from Jerusalem and towards the wider Roman world, beginning its long journey to becoming a dominant world religion. From the ashes of the temple, two distinct paths had emerged, each forged in the wake of catastrophe, each destined to shape the spiritual landscape of the world for millennia to come. The memory of the siege was preserved not just in faith and text, but in stone. In Rome, the Arch of Titus still stands, its famous relief a permanent, triumphant depiction of Roman soldiers carrying away the sacred menorah, a monument to the power of the conquerors. And in Jerusalem, the remnant of the temple's retaining wall, the Western Wall, would become the most sacred site in modern Judaism, a place of profound mourning and fervent prayer, a physical link to a destroyed heritage and a symbol of enduring hope for the conquered. Centuries would pass. And beneath the modern city, the earth itself held its secrets, preserving what no chronicler could fully record. In our own time, archaeologists have delved into the layers of history, uncovering tangible evidence of the Roman siege. They have found the collapsed stones from the Temple Mount's walls, thrown down onto the streets below. They have found arrowheads, ballista balls, and the charred remains of burned buildings. These silent witnesses, buried for nearly 2 millennia, corroborate the ancient accounts, bridging the gap between historical narrative and physical reality, allowing us to touch the past. And so, our long journey through this epic and tragic story comes to a close. It is a story that serves as a timeless, sobering reminder of the devastating potential of human conflict, of the destructive power of internal division, and of the catastrophic impact of war on ordinary lives. But it is also, perhaps most profoundly, a story of the remarkable resilience of culture and faith. It demonstrates the incredible ability of a people to adapt, to reinvent, and to preserve their identity in the face of unimaginable loss. As you now settle into the final, deepest stages of your rest, let the echoes of this ancient story fade. Let the clash of steel, the roar of flames, and the cries of history dissolve into the quiet peace of this present moment. The great struggles of the past have found their resolution. And now, your own struggles of the day can find theirs as well. There is nothing left for you to do but to let go, to surrender to the stillness, and to rest. Sleep now. Sleep deeply.